Today is December 16th. It's the 351st day of the year, and this is the On This Day podcast. That sounded weird. In the 1760s, England is in need of some cash. They spent an arm and a leg to win the French and Indian War in 1763. Parliament levies a series of taxes on the colonies to recoup the costs of the war and to exert control over the colonial governments across the sea. The Stamp Act is imposed in 1765, and it is resoundingly despised by the colonists. The Townshend Acts in 1767 also despised. And the Boston Massacre in 1770 also doesn't help to alleviate the tension that's growing between Crown and colonies. At the same time, in the early 1770s, the East India Company is in a bit of a pickle. They're on the verge of bankruptcy. They're required by law to sell their tea exclusively in London. From there, middleman merchants sell the tea to the colonies at a considerable markup. That, combined with the tea tax that is part of the Townshend Acts, makes East India Company tea really expensive in the New World, which spawns a robust tea smuggling trade that floods the colonies with cheap foreign tea that is sold at a fraction of the cost, even if it is subpar in flavor. There are some, though, who don't drink smuggled tea simply for the cost savings. Some colonists drink the smuggled tea as a protest against the Townshend Acts, taxation without representation, and all that. The Townshend Acts are repealed in 1770, all except for the tea tariffs. But the smuggling continues to be a problem. So in May of 1773, a new approach is taken. And that is the Tea Act of 1773, which allows the East India Company to export tea directly to North America, thus saving the company from bankruptcy and lowering the price of their superior tasting tea in the colonies, which will have the effect of putting the smugglers out of business, ensuring that only legal tea is sold, tea that is taxed under the Tea Act, which both fills up British coffers and reasserts the principle of parliamentary taxation. The powers that be in England assume the colonists will just buy whatever tea is cheapest. But the colonists weren't born yesterday. They're not fooled by the ruse. They still reject any attempt by the Crown to impose taxes without colonial representation in Parliament. By the time they learn of the Tea Act, ships carrying East India Company tea are already en route to America. Ships that arrive in Philadelphia and New York are not allowed to land, and they're told to turn around and head right back across the ocean. In Charleston, the tea is unloaded, but left to rot in a waterfront warehouse. It's sold 3 years later by patriots to finance the revolution. In Boston, however, it's another story. 3 ships arrive in Boston Harbor in late November and early December 1773. First, the Dartmouth, and then later the Eleanor and the Beaver, which we will heretofore refer to as the Beeve. Their presence in the harbor over the next few weeks raises the hackles of many a patriot in the greater metropolitan Boston area. A mass meeting is held, thousands turn out, and Samuel Adams introduces a resolution to send the ships back without unloading and without paying any taxes. Governor Hutchinson, however, refuses to let the ships leave without paying the import taxes, whether they unload or not. And the Dartmouth is coming up on a 20-day deadline to unload and pay the duties, or have its cargo confiscated. The deadline looms on this day in 1773 as several thousand colonists gather around the Old South Meeting House and on Griffin's Wharf, where the Dartmouth, Eleanor, and the Beeve are at anchor. George Hughes, a Boston shoemaker, is among the 100 to 200 or so colonists who dress up like Mohawk Indians this evening and form a raiding party. Hughes later recalls the events in the evening hours of this day in 1773, quote, When we arrived at the wharf, they divided us into 3 parties for the purpose of boarding the 3 ships which contained the tea. We were immediately ordered by the respective commanders to board all the ships at the same time, which we promptly obeyed. The commander of the division to which I belonged, as soon as we were on board the ship, appointed me boatswain and ordered me to go to the captain and demand of him the keys to the hatches and a dozen candles. We then were ordered by our commander to open the hatches and take out all the chests of tea and throw them overboard. And we immediately proceeded to execute his orders, first cutting and splitting the chests with our tomahawks so as to thoroughly expose them to the effects of the water. In about 3 hours from the time we went on board, we had thus broken and thrown overboard every tea chest to be found in the ship. 16-year-old Joshua Wyeth recalls, quote, "Some of our numbers jumped into the hold and passed the chests to the tackle. As they were hauled on deck, others knocked them open with axes, and others raised them to the railings and discharged their contents overboard. We were merry in an undertone at the idea of making so large a cup of tea for the fishes, but we used not more words than were absolutely necessary. I never worked harder in my life." In all, 342 chests of tea are dumped into Boston Harbor on this day in 1773. The King and Parliament are furious with the colonists. Parliament enacts the Coercive Acts as means to punish the colonists of Massachusetts for their resistance, and appoints Thomas Gage as Royal Governor of Massachusetts to implement the new laws that colonists refer to as the Intolerable Acts. Tensions continue to rise, and by 1775, the American Revolution has begun. A year and a half after the Boston Tea Party, on this day in 1773. There are 15 days left in the year. On This Day is produced by me, Dave Schultz. Thank you very much for listening. Born on this day in 1770, German composer Ludwig van Beethoven. He writes 9 symphonies. This one, his most well-known, 5th Symphony. He's almost completely deaf when he writes it. By the time he writes his 9th Symphony, he is totally deaf. When it premieres, he has to be turned around to see the ovation because he hears neither the applause nor the symphony itself. So if you're still listening, gee Wally, that's an awful lot of tea to throw away. Talk to you tomorrow.